Dr. Lindsay, are we ready to get moving?
Thank you so much.
Sure. Have a good class.
How can I reach you?
404-134-321.
I'm not sure they
4320. Okay, sorry for the delay. That's why I wanted to be in at 12:45. So Andrew, I'm going to hand it over to you.
All right. Let me open up to where we should be. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I am Andrew Cohen, and I direct the Jean Beer Blumenfeld Center for Ethics, and I teach in the philosophy department here at Georgia State University. Today's event is part of the continuing Spring 2021 Speaker Series that's sponsored by the Jean Beer Blumenfeld Center for Ethics. The series is titled Ethical Dialogues Across the Virtual University, Multidisciplinary Perspectives. We have brought multiple distinguished scholars virtually to our community, each of whom have fostered rich conversation about the ethical themes in their work. And before I introduce today's special guest, please allow me to promote some upcoming talks. Next week, Zena Hitz from St. John's College will visit on Monday, April 19th at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time to discuss, as she has titled it, The Uses of Useless Learning. And on Wednesday, April 21st at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, Professor Jennifer Morton from the lovely University of North Carolina will be visiting to discuss Resisting Pessimism Traps, the Limits of Epistemic Resilience. All registration information will be available at ethics.gsu.edu. We are delighted to have with us today our friend and a friend of the Jean Beer Blumenfeld Center for Ethics, Dr. Clark Wolf. Professor Wolf is a professor in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies and director of the bioethics program at Iowa State University. Wolf has worked on several books. Now, if you look up publications by Clark Wolf, among the many you find is an interesting treatise on American cheeses by a Clark Wolf, who also serves as a well-regarded consultant for the hospitality industry in the New York metropolitan area and is widely referred to as the cheese wizard. Now, beyond that work on cheese, which this Dr. Wolf might neither confirm nor deny as illicit moonlighting, this Dr. Wolf is more likely to take credit for some books that he has published, including as editor or co-editor on topics such as Key Figures and Themes in Social and Political Thought, Seminal Issues in Applied Ethics, or work on John Rawls. Wolf's book with Alex Tuckness, This is Political Philosophy, is also available from Wiley Blackwell. Dr. Wolf has also published research on issues in intergenerational justice, intellectual property rights, sustainability, and political theory. Dr. Wolf has also been a regular contributor to Bioethics in Brief. And today we are delighted to welcome Professor Clark Wolf, who speaks with Peter Lindsay's class and for our wider community on the theme of human extinction. Welcome, Clark.
Greetings, and thank you so much for inviting me. I have framed this as a class rather than as a talk. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce a few slides, and then I'm going to ask questions of the people in the class, and I hope I'll be able to hear you. So we'll see how that goes. The paper that you read for this session, if you're a member of the class, was a paper on population. And I've enjoyed being excoriated by some of you for things that I said in that paper. I just want you to know that that paper and I parted ways some years ago, and it has not learned much in the meantime. Well, I've learned, I hope, several things. So I'm glad to learn. Anyway, you shouldn't feel any questions about calling that work into question, because I no longer accept everything that I did in it, but we can talk about that as we go along. So what I want to ask as a kind of start off question is, would it be a bad thing if the human species just went extinct? And here is Wilfred Beckerman, recently deceased Oxford economist, who writes, let's suppose that as a result of using up, suppose that as a result of using up all the world's resources, human life did come to an end. So what? What's so desirable about an indefinite continuation of the human species, religious convictions apart? That's from a paper called The Myth of Finite Resources, which was published in the 60s. More recently, Ron Edmondson, and I actually found this one encouraging in a perverse way, maybe. Ron Edmondson, who is a geologist, writes, if we agitate the planet enough, humans may be destroyed, but the Earth, with its enormous spans of geological time on its side, will recover and record our brief existence in a thin sedimentary stratum. From a paper called Are Soils Endangered? So what I want to ask is this: if our actions caused the extinction of our species, would this be a bad thing? And another related question, and you might think of it as a way of asking not quite the same question, but a sub-question: would it be an injustice, right? If it would be a bad thing, what kind of bad thing would it be? Injustices are one kind of bad thing. So is there anyone to whom it would be an injustice? And would it be an injustice to the people who would never exist because of our actions, but who would have existed if we had behaved differently? I do want the issue of justice to be on the table. And I think the concept of justice is a vague concept. It means different things in the mouths of different philosophers, but I want to put on the table the thought that the requirements of justice are minimal moral requirements that apply to us. They're the obligations that can be enforced, right? So not all of your obligations can appropriately be enforced by someone else. If you don't write a thank you note to your grandmother, it's a bad thing. You really ought. She wants to hear from you, and you should write that thank you note. But it's not an obligation that I or anyone else has the right to force you to undertake. Obligations of justice, on the other hand, have victims. They have complainants, people to whom an injustice has been done. And in order to protect them from an injustice, it's often justifiable to enforce, for someone else to enforce obligations of justice. Another thought. Here, obligations of justice are the minimal ones, and they're the ones that can be enforced. They are the ones that have complainants whose rights have been violated, who have a claim against us if we fail to meet our obligations. It follows from this account, right, that an account of justice isn't a complete moral theory at all. There are moral requirements that apply to us that are not requirements of justice. So what I want to put in front of you now is a set of statements that are associated with the concept of justice in various contexts. So you can ask whether social arrangements are exploitative. And if they are, the people who are exploited have a claim against those who are exploiting them. Are social arrangements such that they disproportionately distribute benefits to the wealthy and powerful at the expense of the poor and weak? Many conceptions of justice recognize those sorts of social arrangements as injustices. We might have to think about that. Do institutions effectively protect and promote rights and liberties? Do they appropriately respond to people's needs? Now, not all conceptions of justice incorporate a concept of need, but many do. Another thought: do our institutions unjustifiably sacrifice fundamental needs of some for the sake of less central interests or mere wants of others? And these last two questions, right, incorporate the idea of need, and it is a complicated notion. We might need to think carefully about the concept of needs and how we would distinguish needs from other, perhaps lower priority interests. And I'm not claiming, by the way, that needs are the highest priority interests. They might not be. But I want to think about this issue of justice in the context of population, human extinction, and our obligations to future people who might or might not exist. So putting it this way, do we have an obligation to behave sustainably and what would it mean to have such an obligation? There's a difference between individual behavior that's sustainable, perhaps, and the obligation we might have to make our institutions sustainable, because as individuals, we might, we might individually work to diminish our consumptive patterns, or to generate energy that's correlate to the energy that we use up. But unless we do that as a society, we as a group won't benefit subsequent generations. We need to, if sustainability is an obligation, perhaps even an obligation of justice, it's an obligation we need to exercise together. So these are two concepts of obligation, two issues that present obligations, possible obligations on our plate. So it's worth asking what it would mean to have obligations of this sort, and to whom these obligations might be owed. So putting that in the context of this question that I started with, what's so bad about human extinction, if there is something bad about it? Some people would argue that extinction is at some point inevitable, and it's inevitable that there will one day be no humans. And you could ask, is it worse if that day comes sooner rather than later? I think it's worth also asking about the meaning of future generations for our present lives. So you might consider whether the present meaning of our lives and projects depends in some important or essential way on the existence of future people. And it's not clear to me, by the way, that all of our projects depend on future people in this way. But Dennis McCurley has published a book arguing that many of our projects depend for their significance on the existence of a future for humanity. I'm not sure, by the way, that that's correct. I think that's worth calling into question. So with the idea of, of human extinction and the question, what's so bad? I think this issue has been put on our plate more prominently in the last year or so. I don't know if you've heard the word anthropause, but the term anthropause refers to global reduction in modern human activity, especially travel. It was coined by a team of researchers in June 2020, and in an article discussing the possible impact of COVID-19 lockdown on wildlife in particular. It came out in a journal called Nature, Ecology and Evolution. They had an issue which had on the cover, "Welcome to the Anthropause." And I just want to give you some images in the gap in human activity that was generated by our retreat from all sorts of areas that we had previously been. Panthers came down in Sao Paulo, Brazil. On the Grand Canal in Venice, porpoises were seen frolicking, which had never been seen there before. You could actually see into the water. People waded in the water in the Grand Canal in Venice. And I don't know if you've ever been to Venice, but the water there is absolutely horrible and gross and disgusting. If you walk along those scenic byways, usually they are, it's almost impossible to walk there because it smells so bad. Foxes return to areas where they normally weren't. Here's a herd of deer marching through a downtown area. I don't remember where this was. Here's an area, I think this is Wales, and a town where mountain goats reappeared. They repopulated areas where they'd never been and came down into town to check out areas that they'd never been in. So if human extinction would be a bad thing if it happened, or when it happens, what is it that would make it bad? And I actually want to put this question in front of you as a class. So, I warned you that I was going to ask a question. I'd like you to tell me why, and you don't necessarily need to tell me your view. You might tell me why someone would think that human extinction is a bad thing if you don't think it's bad. Any thoughts on this?
I know it would be bad if you're human centered, like it would be bad for humanity, for one, but other than that, I think the rest of the world would be really okay, or maybe
Wait,
animals
So
that
I'm sorry, I missed one crucial word. It would be
sure.
bad for
humanity.
humanity. Oh, would it be bad for humanity?
Well, they're not here, and that's not good for them. But how will they know because they'll be gone? So
Interesting. I mean, is there something that is humanity that's distinct from the
we're not
individual
humanity. I
persons?
mean just humankind.
Sure. Well, no,
Genius.
I think your answer is deep, right? And it raises the distinction between the good of humanity as such and the good of the individuals who constitute humanity. So I think that's definitely is one of the answers that should be on the table, right? Is there something that we can refer to as humanity that has an existence that's independent from the individuals that comprise it? You might think of species in the same way. There are things that might be worse for every Javanese rhino, for example, but might be necessary to keep the Javanese rhino in existence. I picked the Javanese rhino because it's a species that has very few members, and I think most, or perhaps all of them, have now been imprisoned and subjected to, artificial breeding techniques. So they're living solitary lives in prison or zoos rather than living out in, the Javanese jungle.
Actually,
And,
the northern white rhino, there are only 2 individuals left.
Mhm.
They're both female. So you can see where that's heading.
Sure, yeah. I mean, that's a species that might be headed to extinction.
Might be.
Yeah, right, absolutely. No, I agree. But I'm thinking of the Javanese rhino, they're still trying to keep the Javanese rhino alive. But it seems possible that the only way they could do that would be to do things that are worse for every individual rhino, right? And it seems to me that with respect to human extinction, it might be the same way, right? This thought that it's worse for humanity raises the question whether there's something that might be better for humanity, but worse for every individual human person. But so worse for humanity is one important thought. I think it should be on the table. Any other thoughts on why human extinction would be a bad thing if it was?
Clark, let me apologize that because of COVID, people are sitting somewhat separated. There are 12 students here. I think you can only see about 5 of them, but
Oh, it's all right.
And I could try, if I was better at this, to move the screen around to find the people, but some people aren't even on camera, no matter how I.
It's okay, because what I see of the classroom is actually a tiny little screen on one of my 2 screens. So I'm afraid I wouldn't see you very clearly in any case. So I apologize for that.
Sorry,
If
just
I'm more
wanted to check
technically
that.
adept, I would be better at this.
All right.
So what about the people who don't exist? Is it worse for the people who wouldn't exist than it would be if they did exist? Is existence a value that makes things good for those of us who exist?
We got a respondent here.
Oh yes,
Okay.
sure, please.
Sorry, I just wanted to kind of add on to her argument that it wouldn't really, I mean, I'm not arguing saying it's my position, but you could argue that it would be an injustice to the people who don't exist yet.
Yeah.
Just how you have the pro-life people, with baby, when they try to abort, they're others are hey, it's not a life, it's not even a baby, and other people are just but it's a possibility of life that you're taking away. That's an
Sure.
injustice. You're not giving them an answer, and then we constantly strive. There's that saying that older people usually say, "Oh, my generation's supposed to leave the earth a better place for your generation." And so, if you take that possibility of life for other generations, it wouldn't be fair, right? Because literally, I think a lot of our goals is to kind of keep human life going.
Mm-hmm.
And if we don't do that, then it would be an injustice to kill off humanity through our actions,
Well, there's a difference between killing off people and, not, taking actions that result in their non-existence. So
Right.
I might have had more children than I had, right? I have 2 kids. But is it an injustice to the children I didn't have that they didn't come into existence? Or is
I
it
think
just, by the way, this distinguishes, I think, the case that you're describing a little bit from another case. So the case of abortion and pro-life morality, the thought, I think, of most people who are quote unquote pro-life is that there's a person there, right, who is there to be wronged or to be treated well. And I think most pro-choice persons, advocates would say, the person isn't there yet at that early stage of development. But clearly, with respect to people who don't exist and won't exist in the future, if we take steps that cause human extinction, those aren't people who exist now who could be wronged. They're people who might have existed but wouldn't exist at all.
I would argue the opposite, where those people existing in the future is actually an injustice to the earth, but especially maybe is an injustice for them if the earth is crap, pardon my language, but which wouldn't help them. So maybe them not existing, maybe it's a good thing. But this, obviously I'm arguing the whole other side, so.
No, I think that's a very interesting point. So which are the people, there might be some people for whom it would be an injustice if we brought them into existence. Which people are those?
Clark, just to pick up on your example of abortion, in the other class I'm teaching right now, I taught, Robert Gooden's book on smoking.
Sure, yeah.
And in it, he makes an argument about secondary smoke and your right to subject a fetus to a secondary smoke if you're pregnant. And a lot of my students felt that the mother had no right to subject her fetus to secondary smoke. And then I asked how many of them were pro-choice, which raises the question of whether you have no right to subject your child to secondary smoke, but you do have a right to terminate the pregnancy.
Right.
Now, I'm not sure how that fits here, but I'm intrigued by your question because I like the idea that you perhaps they have no right to exist, but if the planet's still going to be here and they are going to exist, do we have an obligation to make sure the planet is a livable place, and yet perhaps no obligation to make sure that there are humans even on it?
Sure.
Actually, I think we could connect that example from abortion, because what you're saying is if they are going to be here, we do have the obligation, but if they aren't going to be here, we don't.
Great. Good.
Right.
I like that. Can you say more? I like that.
Yeah, so you were saying, I mean, for example, there's the possibility of there being a fetus. There's a possibility of there being a future population. If extinction happens, then we don't have an obligation to them to make sure that they exist. But if they're going to exist, just like the mother shouldn't smoke, we should have a livable environment, and we have an obligation to keep it safe for them.
So to spin out what you're saying that we either have a right to destroy the human species completely, but got to make sure there's nobody left. If there's going to be anybody left, the planet's got to look kind of good for that person.
That's basically what I'm saying.
Yeah.
That's basically the view of Nicolas Condorcet. So I think in the paper you read, I quoted Condorcet, who's said, in his history for a possible future for humankind, written in before the French Revolution, he said, "What we owe the future is not existence but happiness." Right? And what he meant by that is that it doesn't matter that there are more human beings. It's not better if the human species is more populous than less populous, but whatever human beings there are, we have an obligation to do the best we can for them, to make sure that their lives are acceptably well off. Or actually, I think he thinks we have an obligation to ensure that they'll be happy. That's different from this thought, right? The thought that the absence of happy people is worse than their presence. There are people who believe this, by the way. It's actually, among philosophers, it's a fairly popular view to think that it's better if more happy people exist. There's a whole set of papers that are designed to support that thought.
Can you spell that out? Because I'm having my trouble getting my head around it. The absence of happy people is worse than the presence of happy people.
Or no, just their presence in general. So if they're not happy, it's better that they don't exist at all, right?
Yeah,
You know,
Clark, help us out here. You
Or
might
is
have
it like
just done it.
having life satisfaction is better to have some kind of satisfaction in life? Because then if I'm not satisfied, why do I want to exist? Or kind of in that sense,
Mhm.
so that they're not there.
So any future existence, even if it's relatively unhappy, like the existence of John Connor in the future, the Terminator, looked pretty miserable.
Yep.
And you're saying the claim here is that existence is worse than human extinction.
You know, I don't think that's an implication of what's written here on the top sentence there.
Oh, okay, that's why I wanted, no, not the top
Right.
sentence, the middle sentence.
So,
Or after the question.
Yeah, after the question, the absence of happy people, meaning
worse than their presence. Yeah.
is
I'm-
worse than
no,
the present.
No, I just want to say, this isn't a claim I'm making. This is a claim I'm putting out for your consideration.
Right, we're
And
just trying to
what I want you to
understand.
consider, so in thinking about this question, think of it from a God's eye point of view. If you had the ability to create a universe, would it be better to create a universe that was empty, that had no conscious creatures in it? Or would it be better to create a universe that had conscious creatures in it and they were all happy? Let's, here we make them happy people, but let's consider happy animals. Suppose, I think of border collies as sunny, happy creatures, right? So let's suppose you could create a world that has border collies in it and they're frolicking in the sun. Or you could create a world that has no consciousness. It's just stone dead planets like Mars, apparently. Would it be better, right, from a God's eye perspective, to create a universe where there are individuals in it who are happy?
Anybody want to take that question?
My question is that a case of like happiness or just consciousness? Because I feel like those are different things.
Happiness or cautiousness?
Consciousness.
Oh,
Right, so-
Like
consciousness.
if you're saying like
Yeah.
the people could be here but not be happy, or the people could be here and be happy, or there'd be no people. I feel like there's multiple options. Not that the happiness is
Mhm.
constant, but
I have to say, if consciousness evolved, and it's got nothing to compare its consciousness to, the notion of happiness almost seems too hard to fathom.
because you don't
Yeah.
think about.
You don't,
Your
I don't, yeah,
consciousness.
you wouldn't, you'd think about your consciousness as the only thing that you experience, and thus, you might have a category that would be somehow homologous to happiness, but it wouldn't be. I mean, see, happiness sort of seems irrelevant.
Well, it's hard to say. It depends on the view that one adopts. So I put that sentence in this group because there are some utilitarians who hold that outcomes are better if they contain more happiness, and you can't have more happiness without people there to experience it. Therefore, it's better if more happy people exist than if no one exists. Your example about the Terminator universe is slightly different, right? That's a question of whether or not it's better if people exist, whether they're happy or not. And the first question that came to us in this session, I forget, I don't know who posed it, was that there might be people that would be better not to bring into existence, people whose lives would be miserable and unhappy, right? But so this claim doesn't say anything about whether happiness counterbalances unhappiness. It simply incorporates the thought, which is accepted by some people, actually not by me, that if there are more happy people, it's better than if there are fewer. And I put it on the table because it's one thing that people often say when they say that human extinction would be a bad thing, right? Why would it be a bad thing? Well, there'd be less happiness in the world if human beings didn't exist. Of course, there'd also be less misery in the world if human beings didn't exist at all.
Can we take the word happy out of that sentence and say and ask about the claim, the absence of people is worse than their presence?
Yeah, well, I think we could.
In other words, that's where if it seems like you're suggesting we do that.
Well, no, I would suggest that what you're saying now is, so there's the question at the top, and then there are, 4 statements below, which they're not claims that I'm making, they're statements that I'm putting here for your consideration. And it seems to me the third of those removes the concept of happiness, right?
Okay.
The third one says the existence of humans is an intrinsic good. It just is good simpliciter, no matter what their circumstance. It's better that people exist than that they not exist. I'm not convinced that that's true, right? But
Let me ask you, are you guys convinced? Who wants to volunteer a statement or a reaction to that? I'd love to hear. That's sorry, Clark.
Yeah,
but
sure.
I want to hear. I'm looking at 3 people right now. The existence of human, is it intrinsically good? Okay, I'm looking at 3 other people. Go ahead.
I guess like we're taught that the intrinsic. I guess that we're taught that the existence of humans is an intrinsic good. I think of movies where like we go to other planets and start life there, and it just seems like if something bad happens, we're always going to find a way to get out of it. So we're taught that, but I don't think that it's necessary. The Earth lived for millions and millions of years before we did, and like the article that we read said too, we can exist in instance without us as well. So I think we're taught that it's an intrinsic good, especially with religious practices and everything, but I don't think that it's 100% true.
yeah,
Good. Excellent. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I guess I wanted to say, like, at the beginning, I was like, yeah, it's good to exist, but I mean, when you look at it, what's really the difference between us being here and us not being here? It's consciousness. Like, I enjoy consciousness sometimes. So I would want to say that I'd prefer to be here, but if I didn't exist, there's no one here to know that I could have existed. Does that make
Right.
sense?
So I have a question. Do you have a brother?
Yes,
You do. Do you have a sister?
yes.
Do you have 2 sisters?
I have a brother and a sister.
Okay, your second sister doesn't exist, right?
Right.
Is it worse for your second sister that she doesn't exist? And would it be better for that second sister if she did exist? And, a reasonable response to that question would be, that is a senseless, absurd question, Wolf.
She could be a criminal, but she could also be like the next Mother Teresa, who knows,
Sure,
Somebody might love her.
right?
somebody might love her. Well, I mean, that places the value of her life on whether she contributes to other people, right? Or whether she damages other people. But what about her? What about for her herself? Is it worse for her that she doesn't exist?
She doesn't know that.
Okay, go ahead.
She doesn't know.
Say it loud.
She doesn't
Say
know.
it proud.
She doesn't exist.
So you're saying the answer is no.
Yeah.
I tend to agree.
Yes.
Where else
Because it
would
can't be worse for somebody who doesn't
Yeah,
actually
where else would
exist.
she exist to know that it's bad that she doesn't exist here?
Right.
Yeah.
I just stepped on a hypothetical ant. And I
Right.
made life worse for it.
But it doesn't know that.
Do
It doesn't
any of
actually
you know?
exist.
Have any of you been exposed to the great Dr. Seuss's book, Happy Birthday to You?
It's my favorite Dr. Seuss book, Clark. I read it every year
Okay.
as a kid, and I read it every year to both of my kids on their birthday. It's kind of a tradition in our house.
Well, one
Yes.
section, one section of that book says, if you'd never had birthdays, you wouldn't be you. If you'd never been born, why then what would you do? If you'd never been born, then you might be a wasn't. A wasn't has no fun at all. No, he doesn't. A wasn't just isn't. He just isn't present. You have to get born. You have to be born, or you don't get a present.
I am so impressed. Not only does no one know that book, but I've never met anyone who can recite it.
Yeah, well, I think that's a philosophically interesting section from Dr. Seuss.
Yeah.
Right? And the claim, actually, the claim is the claim that's involved in the first sentence there. So I'm gonna say something heretical here. I think Dr. Seuss is wrong. Sorry, right? I think existence, and actually I think Condorcet might be right here, right? That for something to be good for you, you have to be there, right?
I
So
feel like we're implying that life is good.
Good.
Like, we're implying that like life here is good, right? Like, what if it's bad?
maybe,
Like, what if,
Well, yeah, but it is a separate matter whether your existence itself. But I think whether life is good or not is a separate matter, because we're saying that is there not an injustice, but is there an issue for the life that didn't happen?
you know, I think the question of, you know, whether life is good is crucial. So Schopenhauer, for example, argues that non-existence is better than existence, right? Because non-existent people never suffer. And Schopenhauer was convinced that the world of conscious beings includes more suffering and pain than it does happiness. And the happiness doesn't in any way counterbalance or rule out or, you know, make the pain less bad than it would otherwise be. So there is a view according to which the fact that people suffer, the fact that animals suffer, means that it would be better if none of us existed, right? So that's the sort of the opposite claim here. So at the top of the page here says, if human extinction would be a bad thing, if it happened, what is it that would make it bad? And Schopenhauer's answer is that it wouldn't be bad at all, right? It would be better if no conscious creatures existed to be here to suffer.
Yeah, I agree with you, but I was saying that they're conceptually distinct in any case, that you can
Definitely.
separate the question of happiness out from the other question. That's all I was saying. But I said definitely, if consciousness is misery, then at least on a utilitarian account, it's not better to exist.
Right. Well, Schopenhauer wasn't a utilitarian. He thought that consciousness wasn't always misery, but that the misery was bad and the good, you know, the happiness didn't counterbalance it.
Well, there's two things I feel like you need to take into account. One, that it's someone's perspective. You have to have someone's point of view, either your own or that person that does or does not exist. But to figure out if it's bad or good, that person needs to both exist and not exist, like Schrodinger's cat, if y'all know what that is. But for me to know if it's good or bad, I need to exist. Or for me to know if not existing is good or bad, I need to also not exist, which I did at some point.
Yeah.
Now, how would I have a consciousness to know whether that was good or not? So,
Can I tell you?
It's not possible to answer, but
I have a lot of experience not existing. I didn't exist for a huge span of time. So I can tell you what it's like. It wasn't bad at all. I can, you know, I know
you were there
it
to
wasn't bad.
determine that.
I actually have no
yourself.
experience of that, but
But you have, yeah, you have no experience of that because you were there yourself. You know about it because people told you. But had your like consciousness been there without existing, then you could have had your own experience in knowing that, but that's not possible.
Right.
Well,
So
some might think it is, but
so if I say it wasn't bad not to exist, am I saying something false?
depends on who you're asking.
say
Well,
the opposite. Was it good?
Is it good that you didn't exist?
I do know of people who argue that non-existence is better. So Samuel Butler in his novel Erewhon argues that it was better not to exist than, and actually there's a passage in, I think it's Ecclesiastes, that says better off are those who are never born to see the evil that's done under the sun. That seems to imply that non-existence is better than existence. And actually there's an ancient Greek source on this too. Silenus, the demigod, is caught. And he apparently says to his captors, you know, you mortals, you don't know what it's like, but if you really understood it, you realize that it would be better for you never to have existed at all. So there is a view. There are people who have argued that non-existence is good. I'm not sure that I can make sense of the idea that non-existence is good or that it's bad, but I think I can make sense of the idea that it's not bad.
I think it's just the, like, the not good part always relies on the suffering and pain.
Yeah.
But you don't know if a person might actually value the suffering and pain that they've experienced as part of a good part, as a good part of existence. So it's debatable, I think.
I think you're absolutely right. And, you know, in fact, there are philosophers who defend many different sides on this issue. It's not that there are just two sides. There are a whole bunch of different positions to be carved out here. So the statements I've put on the slide here are statements that you might or might not accept. But there are reasons why someone might think that human extinction is a bad thing, right? If the absence of happy people is bad, worse than their presence, if the last generation will suffer deprivation and, you know, pain. When I see science fiction movies like Terminator, it looks like the last generation of humans are suffering. It looks like their situation sucks, and maybe it would be bad because of the predicament that we'd be placing last generations in. There's the thought that the existence of human beings is an intrinsic good, and some people hold that as well. And then there's the thought that the world needs us, or global systems need us, or other creatures need us. And I'd want to point out there are some creatures that need us. So this is a skin mite on one side. They apparently live on us all the time. So we have parasites that depend on us for their existence. And it might be worse for them if human beings cease to exist. There are also farm animals. And I've picked an example of a farm animal that's in a pretty unpleasant predicament. But look, they depend for their existence on us as well. Is it worse for them if we didn't exist so that they will exist as well? Because our farm animals are no longer built so that they can survive on their own. I did put this question, right? The world needs us, or the global ecosystems needs us, or other creatures need us. There are some creatures that need us, but would it be worse if human extinction took place and we weren't there to provide them with what they need to survive? I'm not sure that it would be. But what I want to say is your answer to the question at the top reveals something about your value theory. Some people hold that human happiness is good in itself. Some people hold that it's better. Dr. Seuss apparently holds that it's better if more happy people exist. Is it worse if fewer happy people exist, as long as everyone who exists is happy? You could think of possible future worlds. And by the way, when you're doing population economics, these considerations come into play, right? What future world would be better? Would it be better to have a world of fewer, happier people, or a world of more people whose lives are less well off? And then I think this last question is truly important, right? Does the happiness of some counterbalance the unhappiness or misery of other people so that we can create a grand utilitarian total, right? What's the level of good in a world? Well, it's the total amount of happiness minus the total amount of misery, perhaps, according to some utilitarian theories. I find that a strange view, but it's a view that's accepted by some and actually defended by some philosophers. So I put it in front of you for that reason. I want to distinguish between two kinds of theories about happiness here, right? There are person-affecting theories according to which nothing is good or bad unless there is someone for whom it's good or bad. And Jan Narveson puts that in the sense, it's good to make people happy, but not necessarily good to make more happy people. But then there are impersonal theories about what makes a world good, what makes things good, according to which happiness is good and it's better if there are more happy people than if there are fewer. These are different value theories. And what I'd want to say is your answer to the question, if human extinction is a bad thing, why is it a bad thing? Your answer to that question might reveal things about what kind of value theory you hold, whether you hold an impersonal value theory or a person affecting theory. And these different things have different implications.
Can I just ask for a clarification here, because it strikes me that it's awfully easy to read the personal affecting and the impersonal theories is not mutually exclusive, so or not contradictory. So the impersonal theory says happiness is good, it's better to have more. Does that not rest upon the claim that there have to be people who are happy, which seems to be the person affecting argument?
Well, it doesn't. In the work of many people, I'm thinking of Hilary Greaves at Oxford, who holds an impersonal theory of good, and she thinks that it's simply better if there are more happy people. So
Right, no,
I introduced the question at the beginning, right? Is it worse for the people who'd never exist that they never exist? And I forget who one of you in the class gave a brilliant response that said, if they never exist, then they never suffer. They never are there to experience happiness or unhappiness. It can't be worse for them not to exist.
Well,
But
just a
according to the
clarification.
impersonal theory, it's worse in some overall sense if happy people don't exist.
What if we statements makes it personal and impersonal?
Right, the clarification I want to get, it's not, in both cases,
Mhm.
you need people in order to have happiness is parasitic on or is dependent upon the existence of a person who made, it's a state that only living beings can have, right? So I don't want people to get the sense that an impersonal theory means that happiness can be independent of the existence of vessels of happiness. That's all.
Well, that's right. They need not be human vessels, right?
Right.
We might think of a world, a world in which humans go extinct, but in which animals are all better off because we're no longer there. That might be a world that contains overall more happiness and less unhappiness than the world, the other possible future worlds in which human beings continue to exist far into the future. But the fact that it contains more happiness doesn't necessarily make it a better future world.
This reminds me of, I think it was William Whewell's critique of Bentham, when he said, if it was true that we were trying to maximize happiness, then the happiness of, I think he used fleas or bed bugs,
Mhm.
would have to be counted into the equation. And this is one of the things that drove John Stuart Mill crazy, that drove him to sort of revise the theory, because in principle, if you're trying to maximize pleasure or happiness, and you can't distinguish between the pleasure and happiness of, say, the serial killer and the virtuous person, then what's to stop you from distinguishing human happiness from other happiness? So
Right. Well, there's other happiness, and then there's potential happiness of people who might never exist. So Peter Singer and Henry Sidgwick are two utilitarians. Sidgwick is actually an impersonal utilitarian, but Peter Singer at least used to be a person affecting utilitarian. He said, there are theories of well-being and the value of well-being according to which well-being is like milk. More cows, you get more milk, more human beings, you get more happiness. So according to, some versions of utilitarianism, it's better if more people exist as potential locuses of well-being. But Singer says in one of his early papers that surely that can't be what we mean when we identify the value of happiness. Right? So early on, at least, he accepted a person affecting version of his view. Interestingly, he was driven to an impersonal theory, and I think now he's an impersonalist in this sense. So, any other thoughts on this? Because I was going to change topics, perhaps, in a moment.
gauging the room, I think you can move on.
So I want to think about sustainability. And I want to think about, so the little 2-page paper that I gave you is on sustainability in a sense. So I think population and possibilities of future population are interestingly connected with the idea that we might preserve or fail to preserve resources for future generations. So I want to give you an example of an unsustainable system, thinking that this might give us a way to understand what sustainable systems might be like. And I'm going to give you a story about St. Matthew Island, which exists there, right? It's off the coast of Alaska, above that Aleutian Peninsula in the Bering Sea. And it looks like this. And here's a closer picture of it. In 1944, on this barren island in the middle of the Bering Sea, 29 reindeer were introduced. I think they looked like this and not necessarily like this. But from that initial population of 29 reindeer, by 1957, there were 1,350 healthy reindeer on St. Matthew Island. And by 1963, when I was 1 year old, the population rose to 6,000 reindeer on this small island in the Bering Sea. 1963 was a crucial year because in 1964, the population of reindeer crashed to 41 females and 1 sterile male. What happened on St. Matthew's Island? Well, any projection of what happened? You can guess. I think it's a really interesting example.
They reached carrying capacity and all starved to death basically because they ate too much.
Absolutely precisely what happened, right? It turns out that what was there on St. Matthew's Island was slow-growing lichen. And the main thing that provided protein and food for these reindeer was, there was grass, but once the population rose high enough to around 6,000 animals, there wasn't enough. There simply weren't enough resources to keep all of them alive. So here's the sort of a smoothed out graph of population of reindeer on St. Matthew's Island. By 1980, the population reverted to 0. The last reindeer on St. Matthew's Island died in 1980. So analysis here, right? The island was only so big and the deer consumed the available resources at a rate that was faster than they could replenish themselves. That is, faster than the resources could replenish themselves. And Neil Daw, writing on this case, said any organism that disregards nature's limits threatens its own existence. So this is what takes place on a small island that has a restricted set of resources, right? Are we on an island? We're in a bigger island, right? But if you look at the state of Earth in space, we are in a Bering Sea of emptiness. I mean, space isn't actually empty if you talk to people who study, right? There are things out there, but in terms of resources that are available for us to use, we're in a situation that's might seem relevantly similar to the situation of the reindeer on St. Matthew's Island. What does this imply for the future of humanity? When we look at the predicament of these reindeer, are we bound to a similar situation, right? I mean, when we look at the growth of reindeer populations on St. Matthew's, it looks kind of like this. In fact, we're in a steeper climb than they were. So we could ask ourselves, are we exempt from the rules that govern perhaps less intelligent species? I put this in front of us. When we think of food systems, world delivery, when you think of the resources that we employ, we have to ask whether those resources are going to be set so that they will save us from following the pattern that was followed by these reindeer. What reason do we have to think that we're on a path to escape something like the fate of reindeer on St. Matthew's? Any thoughts?
We might say like, we're more intelligent than them, so we can extend our resources for longer than they could.
Maybe so. How do we extend our resources?
That I have no idea.
Agriculture.
Agriculture. So there might be several different ways to extend resources, right? And when it comes to what I'm going to call hardtack resources, resources that don't grow back like oil and coal, we could simply use them at a slower rate so that they last for a longer period of time. With some other resources, they grow back, right? If we take some fish from the sea, as long as we don't take them at an excessive rate, there might be more fish that could replace them. They might renew themselves as a resource fast enough that we don't deplete the resource. So we might ask, might present resource use leave later generations in the predicament of the later generations of reindeer on St. Matthew's? And the thought is that the idea of sustainability is an alternative to that, right? They went down to a zero population on St. Matthew's Island because they used resources in a certain way. And being reindeer, they didn't have the ability to plan for the distant future. We might ask ourselves, if we want human beings not to go out of existence, is there some way that we could require that we save so that we leave future generations better off than the later generations of reindeer, or perhaps as well off as we are ourselves? And I'll stop there for a moment just to think about what that might mean.
I have a question.
Sure.
In the reindeer example, I mean, I know that they must have died out because there was no chance for procreation left, but had it crashed, and the remaining ones were still, you still had males and females. What would population ecologists say about reaching some sort of equilibrium and never going above it more than ephemerally, and having, I mean, it's sort of, I guess it's different than what Malthus was actually saying, because, but crashing to a level that's somehow sustainable and always, and then you'll go above it, and then you'll go below it, and you'll go above it, and you'll go below it. It seems particularly unfortunate that they were left with only one infertile or sterile male. But it seems to me that you could, that example doesn't preclude the possibility of some measure of sustainability, a much lower population than they had in 1963.
Well, sustainability might not mean stability, right? So you point out, and actually Condorcet, right? Malthus was motivated to write his work on population after reading Condorcet. And Condorcet argued that population would grow and shrink in a kind of boom and bust cycle. And perhaps the reindeer on St. Matthew's Island would have done that if the one remaining male hadn't been sterile, right? So they might have dropped down to a tiny population, regenerated back up to another population that exceeded the carrying capacity of the environment, had another crash, and then fought back to another boom. According to Condorcet, population should look like a sine curve, right? It rises and falls and rises and falls and rises and falls. And according to Malthus thought it would rise to a peak and then crash down to nothing because of the way resources work. So I think the idea of sustainability is in some way an alternative to those two unpleasant scenarios, right? Malthus and Condorcet give us an unpleasant way to think about, what the future of population and humanity might look like. If we can escape the fate of the deer on St. Matthew's Island, I think we might want to do that.
Or not.
I kind of think
We're
back
not.
to some of the articles that Dr. Lindsay had us read. I mean, there've been mass extinctions, not just humans, but like life in general. I mean, humans came later on, which I think it's inevitable for the future.
Mhm.
But it's a case, I think, like if humans can survive the next extinction, whether we, I mean, some of us survive, not all of us, would that be a stability? We would have some sustainability because we would then have more resources because not everybody's here. I don't know if that falls with what we're talking about, but I just kind of thought
Absolutely.
that of the mass extinctions that have existed already on life on Earth.
So we're in the middle of a mass extinction right now, right? The rate at which species are going out of existence now is unlike the rate of species extinction since I believe the meteorite took out the dinosaurs. That was,
Right.
the most recent major extinction event that compares to the one that we're currently undergoing on Earth now.
I think it's even greater than the one of, what was it, 476, which was the big one.
There's no extinction event in the past millions of years that compares.
No, 476 million, 476 million years ago.
A million years ago. Okay.
There was a non-meteor caused extinction that was the largest one of the 5, I think. And I think our rate of extinction, species extinction, is greater than even that one.
That's interesting. I didn't know.
I'm not sure about that, but
Only one of the 5 extinctions.
what's that?
Only one of the 5 main ones are caused by an asteroid.
I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Clark, but I think we only have evidence that one of the last one, 63 million years ago, was caused by an endogenous event. All the others were changes in atmosphere, like the one that's creating now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah, please.
Do you think that like practicing sustainability requires guaranteed like future generations, or do you think we should do it even if we don't know whether we're gonna go extinct or not?
Great question.
That's a great question. Yeah. Well, I'm concerned about the welfare of the next generation. So you're all going to be around when I'm no longer here. I'm 58 years old, and you're, other than Peter, all of the rest of you are going to survive longer than the two of us are. We're going to leave behind a world that you're going to inherit from us. And I think it would be an injustice for us to leave you behind a world that isn't adequate for you. And in the same way, I think it would be an injustice for you to leave behind a world that isn't adequate for the people who will exist after you're there. But at some point, right, that's a chain of obligations. I think a chain of opportunities to do what justice requires that has an end at some point, doesn't it? Because eventually, I do think our species is going to go extinct. But the possibility of sustainability is the idea that we don't need to go extinct because of lack of resources. And I actually think that that's true. I think we don't need to go extinct because we lack the resources that might provide the next generation with what they need for an adequate or even a good life. So that little 2-page paper that I had Peter pass out to you is a model for sustainable resource use. Can I ask, did you get that handout?
Yeah,
because
they did.
My next slide, if I were to go on to it, is about that conception of sustainability.
I'll encourage you to go on to it, but I did want to mention, and I know Andrew and I have talked about, because you put Derek Parfitts on the screen before, and so all of this reminds me, as I'm sure it does you, of his non-identity problem.
Absolutely.
So to throw it out there, you know, if you have two possible futures, one of sustainability and one of sort of non-sustainability. One of the things that, and I'm probably doing a hatchet job on the theory, but one of the repercussions of that is that on one scenario, you're going to have different sorts of people being born than on the other. So the people born on the non-sustainable future, and who inherit a horrible world, you can't measure that against, you can't necessarily talk about their happiness in isolation from the fact that they would be different people were they born from a sustainable present.
Yeah.
So there's a non-identity between those two possible futures.
Right.
And I just throw that in because it adds a wrinkle to it to say that the people in the non-sustainable future are just grateful to be alive, and they wouldn't have even been alive had we gone about our lives in a more sustainable way.
Yeah.
I wonder how you think that changes the way we ought to think about it, if it does.
No, I'm not able to give you my argument concerning the non-identity problem because it's
technical.
long. It's a different presentation, but I slide over the non-identity problem, and I have a philosophical reason for thinking that that's the right thing to do.
All right.
But I think you're right to put it on the table. But I'm going to ignore it for the purposes of this conversation.
Yeah.
And if you want me to come back and talk about non-identity, I'll be glad to do that at another time. But let me also recommend, there's a book by Melinda Roberts called Harming Future People. And in it, there's a great paper by me. I don't know. There's a paper by me anyway. Nobody is convinced by this paper, you know. But I argue that we shouldn't concern ourselves with the non-identity problem when we're considering issues of intergenerational justice. But it's, I feel the need to let you know while I give you that recommendation that my argument in that paper has not convinced the people I intended to persuade.
Well, your conclusion is one I'm in agreement with. I'm inclined not to be concerned with the non-identity problem too. But yes, why don't you go to the handout, because I assured them that you were going to walk them through it in a way that would make it understandable, because it certainly looks intimidating.
Well, yeah, I mean, when you think about, I guess in thinking about the handout, I'd want to think about this in the sense of the reindeer on St. Matthew's Island, right? So I put this in the context of human beings, but you know, think of the resources on St. Matthew's Island, this long-lasting lichen that they were consuming as a renewable resource, K, right? That grows back at a certain time. When the reindeer were introduced at time T, there was a certain stock of that resource available on St. Matthew's Island. You can call that KT. There's a certain amount that they consumed every year. So you could say that's consumption at time T. And alpha, that little Greek letter that I introduced into this model, alpha is the rate at which that lichen grows back once you've consumed some of it, right? So given those four values, right? K, the renewable resource, the amount of it you start with at time T, the amount of consumption at each unit, you can represent the amount that will be available at time T plus 1, right? If you start with a certain stock of that resource at time T, the amount that's left, can you see my cursor here?
Yes.
Okay. It's the amount you started with minus the amount you consume, right? That's the amount that's left multiplied by the growth rate. And that gives you the amount that's going to be next available in the next period, KT plus 1, right? So far, so good. So if the reindeer eat, you know, this amount of stuff, they started with this amount, they eat that amount, it grows back at this rate, this is what they have the next year. And using that, right, using that way of thinking about things, we can think about intertemporal savings and consumption of a renewable stock over time. For any time t, the amount we'll have at t+1 is this amount. Consumption has to be, less than the total, less than or equal to the total amount of stuff you started with, and greater than 0. And this is how it looks, with saving over time. So the problem of sustainability is to find out how much we can consume this period and have no less available to ourselves in the next period. And it turns out this is just algebra, right? So the problem is to find CT, find the amount we can consume now, such that KT equals KT+1, right? KT is the amount you've got at time t. KT+1 is the amount you have in year t+1. We can think of these as years. And to do that, we set KT equal to the amount that's available in t+1, and then solve for CT. It turns out
2 math majors in here, so.
Well, this is just algebra, so it doesn't even require calculus to think about this yet. It turns out, right, you can figure out, if you know how fast your resources are growing, you can figure out how much you can consume now and be no poorer next year than you are this year. And that's the rate of non-depletionary consumption and saving over time. So once this condition is met, no further saving is necessary for non-depletionary use. And a community might save or spend more against later spending or saving, right? So you might think about saving for retirement. If you're saving for retirement, you're saving more than you're consuming, so that you'll be wealthier in the next period than you are now. So when you think about this, right, I guess I want to put our world in front of us again, right? If you think of the world in terms of a sustainable saving rate, what's the difference between the reindeer on St. Matthew Island and the population of human beings on the world? I do think that there's a disanalogy between them. So some of the disanalogies are these: not all of our resources grow. So some of our resources are what economists called hard tack resources, like coal and oil. Once we use them, they're effectively gone. Right? They grow back at a rate that's so small that it's effectively 0. Some of our resource use causes damage. I know you read Wallace Wells' essay from his book, The Uninhabitable Earth, which is focused on the fact that all of sorts of consumption activities, resource use activities that we pursue, push carbon into the atmosphere that remains up there for hundreds of years. It's damage, right? And that's not taken into account in this quick little model that I gave you on those 2 pages. Third, many resources that do grow at some rate don't grow back fast enough to keep pace with our consumption of them. And this means that the world we leave behind will not have in it the same resources that were here when we arrived. It's worth noting that the world we leave behind will have other things in it. Maybe we can compensate the future for the cost of our consumption by producing some kinds of benefits that would substitute for those resources in the lives of people who come later. So the world I was born in didn't have personal computers in it. I'm that old, right? But the world that I live in now has personal computers, and I can't imagine living without them now. I'm absolutely dependent. They improve my life no end. Is it possible that we could compensate future generations for the resource use that deprives them of resources they would otherwise have had? Could we compensate them by providing them with things that they wouldn't otherwise have had that are good? Wind power to produce energy, or solar panels that will produce energy from the sun without causing environmental damage at the rate that we cause it. Thinking about sustainability is thinking about resource use and resource production in ways that measure the value of what we produce against the value of what we use and use up. And this has a long history in economics. And so I think the handout that I gave you included this paragraph from the economist Sir John Hick's book, Value and Capital. And I think it's really interesting, right? Hicks is thinking about income. And it's a little different from thinking about resource use, but I think it's exactly the same as thinking about resource use within the model that I describe on that first page. So Hicks writes, the purpose of income calculations is to give people an indication of the amount they can consume without impoverishing themselves. Right? Think of the deer on St. Matthew's Island. How much could they have consumed every year without impoverishing themselves so that they would have that crash? Following out this idea, writes Hicks, it would seem that we ought to define a person's income as the maximum value he could consume in a week and still be expected to be as well off at the end of the week as at the beginning. Thus, when a person saves, he plans to be better off in the future. When he lives beyond his income, he plans to be worse off. And remembering that the practical purpose of income is to serve as a guide for prudent conduct, I think it's fairly clear that this is what the central meaning must be. So my thought is that when Sir John Hicks wrote this, he's describing sustainable use of income in a way that's exactly correlate to the way I think we need to think about resource use, the use of renewable and non-renewable resources that are available to us but might not be available to the next generations that inherit the planet from us. So I have three examples, but I won't have time to give them all. But I want to think about national debt and resource use in just for a few moments, because I think you'll be surprised. Okay, just before coming to class this morning, I looked at the amount of the current US national debt. Does anyone know how much we owe? Peter, do you know what the national debt is?
Yeah, like 27 trillion.
I'm hearing guesses of 13, or not guesses, informed 27 trillion. Anybody else? I'd say they're in the right order of magnitude.
Yeah, $28 trillion, right? And quickly approaching 30 trillion. So putting that in context, this means that each of us, each American citizen, owes $85,265, and that was earlier this morning. It's changed now. Each taxpayer's share, right? My household is one taxpayer, even though it includes 4 individuals. Each taxpayer's share is $224,748. And I'm gonna leave behind this and put up the national debt clock for just a minute. Do you see this? Yeah, so this shows the debt clock as it's rising now. And you can see right up here, that's the speed at which we're spending money right now. And already, you know, has that increased from the earlier amount? I guess not yet. So my question is, and I'm going to go back to my presentation. Can we think of national debt in terms of resource use using something like the same model that I was describing for resource use on that 2-page handout that I gave you? How do we think about national debt? Now, in fact, I think it might be a mistake just to think about debt in terms of resource use. I think it's much more complex than that. But I do think it's worth thinking about income and debt using a Hicksian model, something like the model of steady state consumption and use. Note, by the way, right, one of the things that moderates the impact of national debt is the rate of economic growth. So one common view is that the size of the debt isn't what matters, it's the size of the debt in comparison with the total size of the economy. And I don't mean to be simplistic about the issue of national debt, even though I have been here, but I don't want to leave you with the thought that this is the final way to think.
We have a
about
question
it.
for you, Clark.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Shoot, please.
Like, when we talk about national debt, like, who are we owing that money to? Like, how do we pay that off?
Yeah, it's a good question. Interestingly, a lot of it is owed to ourselves. So if you buy bonds,
What is that?
you are selling your money to the United States government, planning that the government will pay you back with interest later on. So some of it's owed to ourselves. Some of it's owed to creditors abroad. We've borrowed money from China. A large piece of our national debt is owed to creditors other than the United States. And they borrow money from us because they think we're a good bet. They think we're likely to be able to pay off our debts in the future because the size of our economy is growing fast enough that we're wealthy enough, probably, that we'll have the continuing ability to service that debt. There are economists who will tell you that debt is a good thing. Debt means that you're economically strong. The fact that people are willing to lend the United States money reflects the fact that people think, rightly now, I think, at least, they think that we're a good bet. I hold American bonds, as part of my retirement portfolio. I hold bonds as one piece. So apparently, I think the United States government is a good bet, at least for the proximate future as well.
So are you using this as an analogy to the human population?
I'm using this as an analogy to resource use, right? So just as we can use resources at a profligate rate, we can take out debts at a profligate rate. And if we do that, we're going into debt faster than we can pay it off. And if we do that, we run into a financial correlate of the reindeer on St. Matthew's Island. I'm not arguing that we're there, but I'm putting the problem of national debt before you as an example of a kind of problem that can be modeled using the same mathematical tools, right? And if we're treating our debt properly, our ability to pay off our liabilities doesn't diminish over time. So we're stable according to Hicksian income. Let me give you another example. Anyone heard of the orange roughy?
I eat it.
You eat them. Well,
Yeah.
you might not do that after this presentation.
I don't think I've eaten it in a long time, but it's a whitefish, right? I mean,
It's a fish that comes from deep water. So they used to be called slime heads because they have slimy heads. And until I think it's the 1980s that they came on the market, they were not really available in human consumption. But I want to give them as an example of deceptive description of the process of natural resource use. Sometimes the development of resources involves increasing the productive rate of the resource, and sometimes it simply involves the depletion or destruction of a resource. So orange roughy came on the market in a big way in the 1980s. And when it came on the market, we knew very little about them except that they tasted good, right? They are captured by trawl, and it looks like this. At least it looked like this in the 80s when we started catching them. Trawls targeted mature fish, and initially large catches were in excess of 25 tons. But catches of orange roughy quickly crashed as orange roughy fisheries were depleted, and signs of recovery are not conclusive. You still can buy orange roughy in the grocery store, but I'm going to urge you not to do so, because this is a fish that cannot be commercially consumed sustainably. Why not? Because they are incredibly slow growing. The average age of a consumable fish, it turns out, is 40 years old. So The orange roughy that people were eating in the 1980s, caught in those huge nets, were 80-year-old fish. They live a long time. They have a lifespan of 130 years. Orange roughy live longer than we will. And they don't reproduce until the age of 30. And their reproduction rate is far, far below the rate still at which we're continuing to harvest them. There are areas where it's now again legal to harvest orange roughy, but I think we shouldn't be harvesting them even there. We're simply driving those populations down toward zero. So what I want to say is that when our development, and I'm using this term in scare quotes, when our development of natural resources leaves those resources depleted and exhausted, it can represent a net loss of environmental capital, as it does in the case of orange roughy. The depletion of natural resources can, under certain circumstances, simply be another way to shift environmental costs, or what I want to call environmental debts, from our lives to the lives of future generations. And the reason I introduced debt first is that I think you can identify this as a debt and model it in the same way that we might model national debt. I think there are disanalogies and analogies between the two circumstances. But when it comes to resource use, I think we should think of our use, our excessive use rates of renewable and renewable resources as a debt that we incur to future people who will inherit a world that doesn't have in it the resources that it would otherwise have had. I think we owe those people compensation of some kind. And there's a question whether our activities are adequately and appropriately compensating future people for the disadvantage that our consumption imposes on them. So again, I guess I put in front of you this passage from Sir John Hicks, which I think is an important passage, right? It models individual resource use and income in a way that translates to the modeling of debts. You could use it to think about your mortgage once you have a house, if you could take out a mortgage, and we can use it to think about environmental resource use and what we pass on, the basket of resources that we pass on to future generations, and to think about whether it compensates them for the disadvantages that our present consumption inflicts on them. And I guess I want to stop at that point because, I mean, I can go on. I have more than I can.
I'm gonna suggest that I'm going to suggest that at an hour and a half, we've already kept you as long as I promised. I do want to ask you if you can add. And I have to say that I did eat orange roughy. I don't remember seeing it very often in the markets anymore. I wonder whether there's already a diminished supply of it. But if you could, we ought to add to that list if we want to actually put some information out there. I mean, Chilean sea bass, the Atlantic cod. I'm from Maine, and it looks like the lobster stock in Maine is going to crash.
Oh, is that right?
Fairly soon.
I've heard otherwise for lobster. I've heard that lobster.
Well, lobster's moving north. Yeah. And it looked really good. In the last year or two, we have some telltale signs that the halcyon days for lobstering are over too. But what else do you want to add to that list? The
other example that I sometimes use is cod. And yeah. You know, the cod shoals on the eastern coast of North America are a remarkable resource, right? They provided cod for most of Europe and most of the United States through the 19th and I think part of the 18th century. And we drove them down to zero. And right now the cod fisheries on the East Coast, it is the shame of Canada and the United States that we managed that fishery so badly, because it was a fishery that was one of the richest fisheries in the oceans, and we've driven it to zero. We're down close to zero. And apparently that's an ecosystem that is now in a new equilibrium that simply omits those large shoals of cod from its existence. So it's not that they're coming back, they're gone, right? Unless something changes, that ecosystem is in a new equilibrium that simply doesn't have in it the resource that we overemployed.
The other species I want to mention, just because you mentioned, what kind of obligations we might have. And I'm thinking about how angry I am at our forebears for eliminating so many species that I would have liked to have seen. And
Sure.
the one that comes to mind right away, because their numbers were so massive, is the carrier pigeon, or where what I've heard about flocks of them is that they numbered in the billions of birds, that when they flew overhead, the sky it was like an eclipse. The sky would literally darken. And so you think, well, that's a species that could never go extinct. I mean, you see blackbirds migrating, it's nothing like that.
That's right.
And yet they're totally extinct now.
So do you feel differently about the mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses that used to roam the plains of Iowa?
I am also pissed about, but there I'm pissed about, Paleolithic people, and for some reason I give them less agency or whatever. I think they were hunting for their own sustainability. I think that the massacre of the carrier pigeon I put in and other more recent, the dodo perhaps, other more recent species. I don't know if I'm right to do this, but there's all the megafauna of North America I miss not seeing. Wouldn't it be great? We could walk outside and see a mastodon or something, but I don't know. Do you think I should be as down on Paleolithic?
Well, I don't know. No, I would love to see woolly rhinoceroses marching over the, roaming, actually. I think they would roam over the landscape of Iowa. But like you, I'm not mad at Paleolithic hunters who hunted them to extinction. And that is the theory. The theory is that they were hunted to extinction by human communities on North America.
Yeah.
But I guess when I think about sustainability, I think about resources that we have available to us now, right? And I think about our ability, because I think we are capable of leaving subsequent generations resources that are adequate and available to support their lives in a good way. Right? I don't think we are doomed to leave later generations a depleted world of, my dissertation director, Joel Feinberg, described one possible future as a world where we leave the earth as a used up junk heap. And I don't think we need to leave the world a used up junk heap for future generations. I think we can leave the world in circumstances that are reasonable. But I think to do that, we need to change course in a wide variety of ways, wide variety of policies that are currently underway.
Well, Clark, I think that's a good note to thank you for your time. And I would second that message. Of course, you and I aren't going to be on the planet as long, so as some of these folks are.
No, but we have the right to take out debts that they will have to pay off, right?
Yeah, no, I know.
When we think of that national debt approaching $30 trillion, you and I benefit from that, but the students in your class, right? They're the ones who are going to pay off large pieces of that. And it's a legitimate question to ask whether we're treating them unfairly
Right.
in the way that we're leaving.
I don't think my students have any trouble answering that question. Well, Clark, again, thank you. It's nice to see you again, even if it's virtual. I was reminded by Andrew that the last time we saw each other was right before the pandemic started.
Yes, it was.
And I think it was probably like February of last year, right here in Atlanta at a conference. Or maybe it was January. Little did we know.
Little did we know, yes.
Yeah.
That's the last conference I went to.
Yeah, me too.
I think it's the last time I left Ames, Iowa, in fact. I have been,
Wow.
yeah.
Wow.
I've been secluded and, ensconced in Iowa ever since then, so. Well, thank you for
Andrew?
inviting me. I really enjoyed this. I think,
Yeah,
by the
thank
way,
you.
there's a lot more, right? There are several steps beyond that we should take this conversation from the place where I leave it now. And, so there's the question of what sorts of measures one would appropriately take to ensure that we leave future worlds adequately supplied with the things that are required for human happiness. And that little problem I'm going to have to leave to you.
We'll handle it gracefully.
Okay, thank you.
Clark, thank you so much for joining us, for leading an extremely stimulating conversation. This came up indirectly in some of the remarks, but for those of you who are listening, who are interested in getting a good dose of pessimism that Dr. Wolf was describing, there's a good book by a University of Cape Town professor, a guy named David Benatar, who wrote a book called Better Never to Have Been: The
Yes.
Harm of Coming into Existence. There's some extremely compelling and technical stuff in that book, but he makes that sort of argument that existence is actually a harm and we'd be better off not coming into existence.
It's a spectacular book, and he's a wonderful philosopher.
He's great. We had him visit here, must have been about 15 years ago, and he gave us a brief version of that, and everybody was deeply disturbed about how compelling it was.
Mm-hmm.
Please also
But
allow me
surely
to
his
remind
mission
everybody
starts
about
dark.
the coming visit by Dr. Zena Hitz on Monday, April 19th, the uses of useless knowledge. Details are available or will be soon available at ethics.gsu.edu. And Dr. Clark Wolf from Iowa State University. Thank you very much for joining us. I applaud in your general direction.
Thank you so much. It was great joy to be here. Thanks.
Thank
Take
you.
care all.
Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.